Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's installment of Align's Daily Dose of Advice, our way of bringing you valuable insights and thought leadership from business experts from around the world on various topics that will hopefully help you and your business. As usual, my name is Eugene Turk. I'm the VP of Business Development at Align. If you would like to learn more about Align, you can always check us out at aligntoday.com. And my guest today is Chuck Kocher. Chuck is the founder and owner of the Transformation Company. Chuck has more than 40 years of experience building and coaching high growth organizations. For nearly the past 2 decades, Chuck has been a passionate and dedicated coach, facilitator, author, and teacher that has used the Rockefeller habits and the scaling up methodologies with thousands of clients around the globe. Chuck, it's always a pleasure to see you and talk to you. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Eugene, always.
I know that you have the advantage of talking to lots of companies on a regular basis right now, and I suspect you are hearing lots of different stories about how leaders and executives are responding to this crisis. So I thought I'd start out the discussion by sort of asking you, what are some different things that companies are doing, particularly with culture, their teams, their employees, to sort of keep them engaged while we're all working remotely and apart right now?
Yeah, the answer that's going to be vary because so many companies are having to do so many things differently. Many companies coming into the COVID virus were already remote, so they were kind of built for some of the things that many companies have to do now. So some are being partially remote, some are all remote, and they had to shift to that. And with that shift, the communication and the culture that would be normally there in a brick and mortar setting changed dramatically. So what we're finding is, first of all, don't lose sight of your core values. So many of our companies are going back to kind of the basics and reiterating the core values, the behaviors in different meetings, and sharing them almost like they're starting again, and just to make sure people don't lose sight of how they operate as a company. And there's some subtle differences, obviously, if you're working remotely versus you can walk next door to an office.
Right.
And so they're using technology in a good way, not to hide behind it. Just like our screens are showing today, many companies have their screens up all the time, so people can see each other and click and connect and things like that using FaceTime and other technology. But it's really just taking, if you have a great culture coming in together even more, and teams, they come together. If you don't, then you're going to have more challenges. You're going to have work even harder to bring that culture together, because if it wasn't healthy before, this can just exacerbate that issue. So every company comes at it a little differently, but at the end of the day, I always say to anybody with any company, any type of company, if your culture comes together and your team coalesces and becomes more cohesive, you're doing some great work, and continue that work, continue bringing that in. For example, Southwest Airlines, I'm very close to them because I fly them. Was on a webinar with them the other day, and they're very a very close culture, and what they're doing is social happy hours. Their CEO is communicating overtly more than he ever does, and they usually do a lot about what's going on. He's connecting with all his leaders one-on-one, and this is what Gary Kelly's doing. It's a big organization, 60,000 employees, and many of them are not working, and they're trying to prevent a furlough because they never had a furlough. So they're doing a lot of creative things to bring their culture to life and keep it alive during this time. But most importantly, they're training, they're developing, but they're still having fun,
Right.
in a tough time. So whatever your culture is, I encourage you to keep it alive or bring it to another level of life, because that's what's going to get you through this stuff. And that's what's going to hold your people together. And remember, the biggest and most important thing, Eugene, is everybody's feeling isolated. Everybody's feeling away from things. And I think you were on the virtual summit a couple of weeks ago with David Meerman Scott said, you've got to connect, not just to text or an email, but get visual, with your people. So that's another thing. Be very visual. Don't just send texts and emails, but definitely communicate a lot, and still try to have some lighthearted fun when it's appropriate, because we all need that.
obviously, we're starting to hear a lot of stories about companies that are pivoting, whatever
Mm,
their original business model or whatever their original product or service offering was. There's no
mhm.
marketplace for it anymore. And so, in order to survive, they are now sort of pivoting that product or service offering. So, I was
Yeah,
wondering if you had some specific examples that you could share with us of companies
yeah.
or industries that are undergoing those types of pivots right now.
Yeah, there's I can share a lot of client stories. A couple come to mind, and some of it's not just to something new. Maybe it's just a different way to get to what they would normally do. So one of them, for example, is a restoration company. They're based on the East Coast. So what they do is, fire, hurricanes, things like that up and down the East Coast. And they happen to have a great A-player sales team in place now that they didn't have a couple of years ago. So as they were looking at some of the business slowing down, all of a sudden we've had what? Tornadoes, right? And several storms cut across the country. And normally they wouldn't even look at it. And their sales team said, let's go. And, I think it was Nashville recently, and let's go in there and see what we can do because they're really good at what they do. And so they figured out they got their sales team in, and they got several very large deals. And then they brought key staff in, and they have subcontractor relationships that deliver on their level of quality and service. And boom, instead of losing money sitting there waiting for the hurricane season, they pivoted right into the tornado season, if you will. Another company literally had their supply chain. So they were working on, they identified a new supply chain pre-COVID, and it was going to save them like 20, 30%, cost, which is extraordinary. And so they pivoted towards that new supply chain. And guess what happened? The whole supply chain collapsed. Then they pivoted again to another way to get to deliver their products, another supply chain that collapsed. And then they pivoted again. Now they've locked down a supply chain that's reliable and will be open throughout this COVID pandemic. And on top of that, their sales dropped early on, and then they came back because their demographic actually is willing to spend the money on the products and services that they have. And now they have the products actually to provide it. So what a pivot. That was multiple pivots within a company. We have a healthcare company that had a big choice, big choice. They're a large entity, about 45 million in home care service. Different call. They made the call that they would serve clients and patients who had COVID-19, and that's a big call to
Right.
make. But they're one of only two in their region that did it. Their brand, which has always been all about their patients and their community, actually got highlighted even more. And when they come out of this, they're going to be in a significant position. They took all the precautions, and to date, they have no internal things that have affected them with COVID. And then the second thing they did, because they work in the world of Medicare and Medicaid, and again, that could be a low margin business if you take the wrong type of patients on board. They identified, just as COVID was hitting, who are the primary people we need to care for. And many of them are senior citizens. Obviously, that's a big issue. They opted to do that. And then they opted to work with their payer sources so to protect their margin. And again, they pivoted multiple times on different things. We have another company that literally took their business to a completely different part of the world that they selling their products and services to. We have another company that actually is taking advantage of the situation, meaning more people are at home. They teach languaging, mostly Spanish around the world, and all of a sudden they were looking at doing something different coming into the pre-COVID timeframe, and COVID hit, and all of a sudden their sales took off. So
Mm.
they've introduced several new programs centered around learning the Spanish language. So lots of cool stories. We've had a couple of companies had to literally shut down a bunch of their services because they had to, because they were not essential. But they decided, okay, but we can still do outside work if the client will allow us to. It's a construction company, and guess what? They've been picking up more outside work And again, the weather's cooperated in their region
Right.
also. But they picked up more outside work that overcame all the inside work that they lost. And then another company that's in electrical contracting, they have so much business they can't keep up with it, which again, sounds counterintuitive. And their issue is people. So what's happening is all the smaller electrical contractors are struggling. They may not make it through this. And guess what? There's A player talent available. They've hired two critical positions and a bunch of techs that are coming to their company to enable them to now continue to scale through this time. And now the pipeline, they have a great pipeline for the rest of the year. And no matter what happens, many of these jobs have to be done. They must be done. So again, those are some subtle examples. But I think the biggest thing is, can you do something different with the products or services you have? Can you target it differently? Can you potentially move into a place that you would never have thought of?
Right.
There's all kinds of industries right now that need help and assistance. We hear that all the time with equipment and the masks and all the other things that are going on. So we've had a couple of companies pivoting into those areas also.
And Chuck, so for companies that are pivoting, or even companies that don't have the advantage of being able to pivot, so how are they planning in terms of strategic planning through this COVID crisis? Whether that be planning for the pivot, or sort of taking whatever they originally planned for Q2, or maybe annual planning that they did for 2020, and sort of looking at different scenarios, maybe their revenue's down 25%, 50%,
Yeah.
75%, and how are they sort of planning through this?
Yeah, and planning kind of took on into a new life, right? Because literally in early March, there were people doing quarterly plans for Q2 in 2020, and then within a day or two, they changed, right?
Right.
So what we were doing with all of our clients early in March, when we saw these changes coming, we're asking them to think of three different scenarios. Now, you could probably come up with 100, but three scenarios with assumptions, right? With key factors and assumptions, whether it's going to be shutdown, long shutdown, no shutdown, business as usual, business disappears, that kind of thing. And so we planned early on with most of our companies with scenarios. And thankfully we did, because a couple of things happened within a day or two from that planning. Now that we've kind of, I'm going to say, we've kind of got into a slower rate of change with COVID-19 right now as we speak. But in the beginning, it was like almost every moment legislation change, that type of thing. It's calmed down a bit. So what companies are doing now, every one of our companies have a 30, 60, 90-day game plan. And they have different scenarios, for each of those areas. So for 30, 60, 90, worst case scenario, 30, 60, 90, everything we know today, all the facts, the things that we can anchor off of, patterns and trends, this is what we're going to do, right? And
Yeah.
then in some cases, we have a better, and there's opportunity. So it's above that. So, so each one is different. Some are, bad, I hate to use this language, bad, worse, and worst,
Right.
Cases, because they've had to shut down or almost limit their business. The big thing, though, Eugene, is the cash and the cash flow. How do we, keep the oxygen in the business at some level, and then protect the critical employees, if not all the employees, the critical A players or the essential employees within the company. And that's always a difficult thing. But, at the end of the day, you got to keep the company alive, because if you don't, there'll be nothing to come back to. So you have to make some very difficult calls in some cases. Many companies have been able to leverage some of the government assistance in the U.S., the
Right.
payroll protection plan and other lines of credit, or they had good cash position coming in. But everybody is looking at expenses, and they're looking at decisions and using resources only when you get a return on investment. So there's no like, let's try this new marketing program. No, we're really trying to think, what's the word? Optimistically objective, but very honest. Take the brutal facts, and like the Stockdale paradox that Collins talks about, the brutal facts, let's be honest about them. And then let's try to look for the opportunity, but not something that's just a random idea. So they're thinking on things, but moving quickly,
Right.
which they don't always go together. Sometimes you move quickly, you don't think. And in this case, if we're going to process it on logic and fact and not emotion, because it's real easy to go with emotion when you're struggling or you're not sure what to do. So we're trying to insert that into companies also. But that idea of the shorter term, 30, 60, 90, and then being able to move, through those different scenarios is really critical, because if you don't do that, then you're caught off guard, and then you may make a rash, quick decision. So even though it feels like it was going so fast, it has slowed down. And then the next part of the planning that's happening too, every one of our CEOs are beginning to look at, okay, what's the new normal or abnormal, like Mark Cuban said, going to look like? And if it starts to curve up, what's that scale back up plan? If they're not scaling already, because some are literally scaling right through this crisis. So it's really taken on a new light. And I think your dashboard has to be the impact of COVID, both internally and externally to your business. And whatever those things are, those categories that you have to look at. And many of us, we all have to look at social distancing, remote work, and travel and other things, right? But every company might have some unique things they need to be tracking and paying attention to, because as you watch the patterns, then they become more, wow, that's going to happen, versus we're not sure, just looking at a bunch of things and operating on an emotional level. So we're tracking it like a scoreboard, if
Right.
you will, something that, you can almost put into a line, right? Like the sweat that Vern has with scaling up, if you
Yeah.
will.
All right, Chuck, the question that I ask every person that comes on to the Daily Dose of Advice: what
Yeah.
is the number one piece of advice that you are giving your coaching clients right now?
Yeah. Well, working with directly with the CEO, with teams, it's absolutely staying focused on what you can do, and making decisions with a objective mindset, with facts, not emotion, and communicate, and be very honest. Do not speculate in your communication. Be very factual. And then the big thing, stay connected to your people,
Yeah.
stay connected to your clients, stay connected to your vendors and supply chains, and the resources, and have a place. If you're a CEO and a leader, whether it's EO, YPO, Vistage, I don't care, or your coach, your consultant that you work with, do not is get some balance. It's easy to get sucked into work, listen to the news, and things like that. You got to have balance. So somehow, when you're home with the kids, family, if you can get out. If you exercise, figure out another way to exercise, but get away from it. Shut it
Yeah.
down. Shut all the noise, because the noise is overwhelming, and quarantine is not good for anybody. So that's kind of the big tips that we're offering out.
Chuck, always a wealth of knowledge and advice. I appreciate hearing from you. It's always been a pleasure to work with you and to sort of bounce ideas off of you. If you'd like to learn more about Chuck, you can always check out thetransformation.company. So it's thetransformation.company. Again, if you'd like to learn more about Align, you can always check us out at aligntoday.com. And we hope you will join us for our next daily dose of advice. Till then, thank you so much, and we hope you make it a great day. Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Eugene. Always a pleasure.
All right, man.